So ultimately, Metatron is not an entity to the extent that I don't even view myself as an entity. It's a wisdom field. It's a gate. It's a doorway more than anything else. Now, if you think about it, it's the opposite dynamic of what we'd normally think. We think that wisdom comes to us. It's actually the opposite. Wisdom is discovered through us. And then reality arises accordingly based on the interpretive responsiveness of what our mind is going to do once we understand that our mind is not us anymore.
Right.
Okay. So look at the path of this Metatron mythology. It really tells us everything we need to know about this. Metatron started as Enoch. Now, this is articulated in texts from the Merkava period of the earliest Kabbalistic sources, particularly 3 Enoch is the main text of this, where Enoch was a human being, right? Who walked the earth like you and me. In other words, Enoch was stuck in the realms of apparent time and space and substance. Enoch was a conceptually fixated being. And Enoch was taken up without tasting death and became Metatron. Now, isn't that what we want to do? Isn't that sort of the model of what a practitioner aspires to here?
Right.
So in a sense, we could say we want to become Metatron rather than encounter Metatron as some sort of separate being or separate authority or whatever it is. We want to assume that wisdom in the stream of mind itself, meaning intimately. We want to realize the stream of that wisdom. So the Metatron symbol, the symbol of the display of that wisdom, has some interesting symbolic connotations that are really useful and are quite instructive as well. It's portrayed as both a youth, and is called the youth, in some of the literature, but also described sort of as an elder,
Right.
both very, very young and very, very old. Well, what does that tell you right there? Is beyond time. But the
Right.
youth is particularly interesting because, in a sense, wisdom is continually being born. It's continually beginning. It's just like the first word of the Bible, in the beginning, Bereshis bara Elohim. What does that mean, in the beginning? Well, it is what you are. If you view time and space as linear, then there's a beginning point of origin, which also implies there's a cessation point as well when the Messiah comes. Well, what if that linearity were to change and the beginningness was continual without these bookends of origin and cessation? What if it was a quality, beginningness? That's the youth of Metatron, eternal youth, not a youth that gets older. That's the first thing. The second thing is that in 3 Enoch, Metatron is viewed as a fire being, a being made of fire. That fire is the essence of the life force itself. It's the chashmal. It's the chaya. It's
Yes,
pure
the life.
pure dynamism.
Yeah.
So it's life force at its root, you could say. That's the wisdom. That's the chokmah. So in a sense, if we take away this idea of reduction to personality or the status of a being as an angel or an entity or what have you, it's really like a chariot with no rider, which is how we should view ourselves from the outset in this view. And this is what we're going to do with all the presentations of wisdom that we rely upon to help us. The holy guardian angel, Agatha Diamond, the guru, God as judge and creator, all of the angels. Like, if what you do with anything is what you do with everything.
Yeah, what's really interesting too, you talk about the fire of Metatron. It's a very theurgic idea as well. Description. They have this idea of the theurgic appearance or theurgic theophany, where the different types of entities, deities, will have different types of light. And, it'll be purer if they're hypercosmic and closer to the source, closer to the one. It'll be a little bit more ruddy if they're genagogic, the gods, that deal with material phenomenon. Now, one of the interesting things too that where this springs to mind, I think may be useful for people who are interested in ceremonial magic and the hierarchies and all this stuff, right? I think Immanuel Kant called all this stuff like the mental castles that we build, right? And you talk about this, the reification, the objectification of this stuff. When in reality, when you really look at like something like the great chain of being, and ontological participation, rather than seeing it as this like network of entities, this rungs of a ladder that you have to climb, which I think can be useful starting out. I think once you have that experience, that the minute nullification outside of space and time, you kind of come back and you're like, oh, this stuff, they're not talking about an actual discrete thing. It's all trying to express this idea that you're talking about, which is that it's all one thing. It's all one thing, and our various sort of corruptions or maybe mistakes of perception are what make everything look discrete. Whereas this idea of unity, that theurgic chain of being, is just saying everything is one, because ultimately, even phenomenality is collapsed like an accordion. It's
well, that collapse is what happens literally when the lower nine Sefirot collapse into Keter,
right.
and Ein Sof is realized as a transparency through that point, that collapse. But another thing that might be very interesting to say here at this point is that the concept of one, everything is one is insufficient to describe this view, because if it's one, then what you have is a monad, and you can reify that monad.
Absolutely, and we do frequently. And they accounted for this in saying that everything, even the monad, comes from the one which is not.
Right, exactly. It's not everything, and it's not nothing. Those terms are obsolete at that point.
Right.
Okay, so we have a secret weapon, though, in what you're talking about, with the various levels of the fire that is cultivated alchemically. We have a secret weapon.
Mm-hmm.
And that secret weapon is we can cut to the highest view at all times. We don't have to be subjected to the levels as places to get stuck or caught. Mm-hmm. We can always find our way out of any state of containment by deferring to the highest, by first understanding it intellectually through our study of it, and then by practicing to it aspirationally. And things are seemingly contained or seemingly stuck in that way. We can always develop the habit to defer to the highest, remember Ein Sof, and more importantly, love Ein Sof. Because the concept of love has a magical quality. And that magical quality is the quality to pervade whatever phenomena is at hand. So if we cut to the highest and really understand what we're doing, and love that sublime essentiality, mm-hmm. it will pervade every thought that we have about it and all of the qualities of its experience. And they surrender, they essentially dissolve there into that effusiveness. And that makes our contemplation devotional. And devotional mysticism is the secret weapon. I mean, we could always defer to the highest devotionally through our love of the sublime. And if we don't do that, well, I don't know what we're going to do, because to me, that's the whole thing. I mean, to me, it's either that or nothing.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and again, just to offer the Platonic theurgic kind of component, Eros, it's funny, everybody goes around in the symposium and it's all orators and playwrights and things like that. So they're all trying to one up each other, and they're talking about how these beautiful orations about Eros and the highest of gods. And then they get to Socrates, and in his usual sort of, contrarian manner, he's like, Eros isn't a god. Eros is a daimon, meaning it's an intermediary. It's something that takes you to what
It's a
to that.
gate.
Exactly, it's a gate. That's
Yeah.
exactly how he puts it, and everybody's just kind of like, "What?"
Well, it's exactly what I'm saying. Metatron is a gate.
Yeah.
Metatron is a portal that allows you to merge the immanent and the transcendent. If it's viewed as a being, I think you've blown it, because then you're dumbing it down to a conventional habit.
Yeah, and that's such an important thing. One of the, preliminary, initiations in fact rather than in form is to understand that you got to break your habits of literalism that are even the ones like you're saying that are subtle, where they're appearing as discrete images and anthropomorphizations in your mind.
Well, that's how we learn.
Yeah.
I mean, we learn through a symbol language. And the reason we learn through a symbol language is because words, discursive conceptuality, doesn't do the job completely.
Mhm.
So symbols pick up where language leaves off. And then we could use both together, but symbols transcend the limitations of discursive conceptuality, which is what, discursive conceptuality is not just talking about ideas. It's how we think through the understanding of things privately, mentally.
Mhm.
When we see something, very often we speak to ourselves internally. It is this thing. It has a name. We name it, we make a conceptual designation, and then a mental construct is reified and we place that in memory. The entirety of our world on a conventional level is just a series of memory units that are organized into patterns that have chains of association. And those chains are amplified into networks, all based off of memory. So, for example, if I say chair, you're going to think of the image of a chair and say to yourself internally, this is a chair. Well, that relates to not only every chair that you've ever seen, but the concept of sitting,
Mm.
the concept of posture, the concept of material, the concept of furniture, this, that, the other thing, then vast networks of association. Now, if all of that is based on what you have implanted into the networks from associative activity that has been discursively derived, then when you see a chair, you don't actually have a direct experience. You're just deferring to these chains and networks. So you are removing yourself from the actuality of the experience by deferring to a conceptual understanding of it. Well, that puts you at a great disadvantage when you immediately connect with reality. That's why
Yes.
conceptuality is a problem for practitioners, because we study so much
Yes,
about
exactly.
all this that it squeezes our opportunity to enter into that field of phenomena to nothing.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
squeezes the life out of it.
I had somebody ask me, "Hey, do you think it was your experience or was it the study that you did?" And I said, "Look, knowledge, if you do nothing with it, it ultimately equals shit. Because especially in what we do, the phenomenological component being so central, but there's such an obsession with the academic study of it. It's like putting together a puzzle. And yeah, it feels really good when you get two pieces to snap together and it fits. But then you got to move on. It becomes this endless puzzle. And right, let's say I'm doing a puzzle of a fire truck. Even if I finish the puzzle, I will never know what it's like to ride in a fire truck. It's the
Yeah, what
puzzle's
you're
not the experience.
this is the problem with dot, and this is why knowledge-based systems are not the same as wisdom-based systems. So what you're describing is dot, and the reason why it surrenders and ultimately collides into Keter and dissolves there. And in that dissolution, wisdom is realized. Now, the interesting thing about dot is it's a necessary evil. We have to do that.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we'll never get to the point where we can surrender. We need to intellectually, at least in the beginning, know what we are doing. So I
Mhm.
wouldn't dismiss it or diminish it in any way. It's massively important. But that's not mysticism. That's something else. That's sort of the preparation for entering the portico.
Right.
you could say. All right, so look at the little diagram that I have on the lower right-hand side of the screen here, which is exactly what we're talking about. First, we assemble our understanding intellectually of what we're doing. That inflates our dot by giving us the ability to contemplate and study it, right? Then, based on the inflation of our dot, which exaggerates it beyond all normal proportions. I mean, if you think about it and you study metaphysics, you're asking your brain to do something that, right, even at that primary stage, is abnormal. It's not the normal thing that the brain does, studying the technical ins and outs of the complexities of reality on an essential level. But if we do that and inflate our understanding of it, our dot grows and grows and grows based on the amount of imaginal power and life force that has been raised into that study. So the 9 Sefirot are raised and they all accumulate at that dot point. And this is where the abyss doctrine comes from. Because if you only have a conceptual understanding of this material, then lo and behold, voila, you have an abyss.
Yeah.
You have an impassable point where to cross it becomes this huge foreign trajectory that is then turned into a kind of a theatrical moment where
Yeah.
you stand with your robes in the sanctity of the temple about to approach or at least acknowledge the great abyss before you. Well, what that does is sort of puts the pressure on the conventional mind tasked with a job that is more or less impossible from the perspective of the conceptual mind. Wouldn't it be easier if you just held the highest view from the outset and used it aspirationally to devote your life to rather than dramatize it in a way, which I'm not even saying that the dramatization of it won't work. I'm just saying that the likelihood that you'll slip into it organically through breakthroughs might be somewhat constrained or constricted
Yeah.
at
Yeah.
a worst case scenario. Okay, so that's the cataphatic portion that we use. The cataphatic portion is the use of our conceptuality to get to that point of breakthrough. But then comes, and this has to happen by itself. You can't make it happen spontaneously. You have to surrender all of it into this apophatic release, which is where the dot, which becomes the repository of everything that has risen throughout the lower 9 Sefirot, collides into Keter, and at that point releases itself there, so that for at least some gap in your the mental continuum of your work, there is no dot anymore. Like we when there is no dot, there is no abyss.
Right.
See? So at that point, what the breakthrough does is really, really important, because it's not like you release it and then there's nothing. There is, in a certain sense, nothing, but there are also sublime qualities of that nothing. And those sublime qualities are referred to by a word that Hermetic Kabbalists seem very, very unaware of, and that's the concept of the tzach-tzach-ot. The tzach-tzach-ot are all the splendorous, sublime qualities beyond Keter. One could say that they're worlds, infinite worlds upon worlds beyond Keter within the Or Ein Sof. But you don't want to reify those into places. You know, like we have the lower 5 worlds that everybody knows, the suits of the tarot and whatnot. And many people reify those into places, like places you could go. Well, if we dismiss space and time, we're throwing away this concept of a realm or a place entirely. Because where are we now? What is this place? Well, it's nowhere. You know, it's in the heart of the divine. That's a placeless place. Right? So if we develop that habit, that tzach-tzach-ot becomes sublime qualities. And those are the qualities of the 9 chambers. That's how I present them. So the cataphatic work that gets us to that point invites apophatic release. But then something happens, and you're going to be hard pressed to find this in the mystical literature. It settles back down into the heart of phenomena. It doesn't just throw you up into nothingness and leave you there. That doesn't happen. That's a fantasy. In reality, it settles back down to change the meaning of reality. And I call that the post-apophatic state. In other words, the breakthroughs that you've made apophatically assume the body of the cataphatic world that you thought you were in. In other words, the immanent body bears the meaning of the transcendent essence of it. And then you live a visionary life to whatever extent that you do. And I'm going to articulate for you a little bit how I describe that with the Sefirotic and Kabbalistically. And really it comes about through an amalgamation of Tiferet and Yesod. And that's where the philosopher's stone crystallizes in the heart, what's called in Kabbalah the aspaklaria. So let's go to the next image and talk about that a little bit. Now, this particular set of complexities over on the left is a description of the Tzachzakot in a way that is a little different than what most people have seen. When we're talking about the Tzachzakot, we're talking about the sublime qualities of the Or Ein Sof. People think that the Or Ein Sof has no qualities. That is untrue. It has wisdom qualities. It has primordial qualities. They're not the qualities of substance or dimension or time or concept. They're primordial wisdom qualities that are realized. They're sublime qualities. They're the qualities of divine essentiality, which can be borne out through every detail of phenomena. And that's not what the great mystics of the past tell us. The great mystics of the past talk about sublime qualities. Can you still hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You
Okay.
cut out there for a second, but I heard the last bit.
Okay. How bad has it been with the cutting out?
Not terrible. There's a lot of material here. It's, we've got some editing to do for sure, but it's probably happened like 4 times now.
Okay. When I talk about the Tzachzakot and the sublime qualities of the divine, I talk about it in terms of this interaction that is described in texts like the Emerald Tablet, where you have a consideration of what the Emerald Tablet calls the one thing, provided that you understand what they mean by one as more than a monad. But it's an interaction of the sun and the moon. Without getting into a whole analysis of Emerald Tablet, what do we mean by this? Well, when the sun and the moon function as qualities in concert with each other, it's best to describe them in terms of the Sefirotic. But beyond Keter, those qualities are so integrated within each other that you can't really make distinctions between them. They are blended. They are perfectly integrated within one another so much that they have no distinct state of being apart from each other whatsoever. But that doesn't mean that we can't understand them. And these distinctions, which are not apparent distinctions, are the subtlest distinctions we make in practice. So what I like to do is talk about these functions in that mixed form, where really what we're talking about as the Or Ein Sof is light and space, right? Or light and darkness, we can say. We have to refine what we mean by this. So the moon, which carries that light into all of its iterations, is a luminosity, but it is a luminosity that is dark. Right? That it can't be reduced to positive and negative terms. So positive and negative terms, we'll leave that for the qualities of the Sefirotic. on and off, chesed and gevura, sure, that's appropriate language. But on the level of the tzachzakot, we can only talk about the divine light as an unknowable darkness, ungraspable, that cannot be reified. So the wisdom light is a dark luminosity, and that's the aspect of the moon. The sun is much more difficult to talk about because it is that darkness which conforms to any opacity that can be shaped out of it. But that dark conformational quality is in and of itself inherently luminous. Now, these qualities of the sun and the moon become Chokhmah and Bina in terms of the Sefirot, but on the level of the Tzachzakot, they can only be apprehended on the subtlest possible levels in meditation. And they are distinct from each other, but they're not apart from each other. Now, the reason why the luminous darkness, which, like I said, conforms to the shaping of things, and the dark luminosity, the reason why I posit the sun and the moon in this way, one on the right side and one on the left side, is the exact reason why one.
You're gonna want to repeat that. The exact reason why what?
It's the reason why the gender attributions of sun and moon, especially in the Emerald Tablet, are switched from the normal one. And this is what they do in most schools of Tantra. And it is not common in the West, but because of my training, I defer to exactly the opposite of what the Emerald Tablet tells us, that the sun is its mother and the moon is its father.
Wow.
You know, and this is why that set of gender attributions is carried that way throughout my system, where the usual male and female dispositions of sun and moon are reversed, because really they are reversed from what we usually think of them. Actually, mysticism is a reversal of every preconception that we have about reality. It's the direct opposite of every normal assumption that we make.
Yeah.
So this dark luminosity, which is lunar symbolically, is the wisdom. That dark luminosity is what's carried forth as wisdom through everything that is known and every means that we employ to know it. Right? That's the wisdom that breaks through all the epistemological and ontological assumptions. The luminous darkness, like I said, which is conformational, that's the interpretive responsiveness itself. That's what we call space. But when we talk about space, we're not talking about merely physical space. We're also talking about the space of the consciousness that apprehends it. And on the level of the Tzachzakot, there's no difference. So the space of the mind and the space of the world in which mind finds itself is what we could call basic space. And that basic primordial space is the interpretive responsiveness that becomes any reality that is asked to be displayed. Like I said, we get the reality we deserve.
Yeah. And this portion really, speaking of Tzimtzum and the Tzachzakot of the Or Ein Sof, reminds me very much of the Timaeus, in which it starts off, Timaeus tells, Socrates and everybody else, look, I can only talk about this symbolically. So, and we're only human beings, so we have to talk about it in terms of symbols. So right there, you should know not to necessarily reify what he's talking about, but look at the underlying relationships. And the thing about the demiurge is that he creates time by creating space. And in the Platonic, version, the Tzimtzum is more what we call the moving image of eternity, which is this contrast of the circuit of the same and the circuit of the different. And he puts these two things together. He interlaces them like this here. Hold on. These two, this here And this here, without the globe in the center, he creates, the space, the container, and it's a unification of opposites that creates space and therefore time. But what's really interesting regarding the Tzimtzum is that the demiurge doesn't do this from the contents of his own mind. Timaeus says he turns towards the eternal. And what he sees in the eternal is what he bases this blueprint on. So he's looking at kind of what you're talking about, the Tzimtzum. He's looking to the Or Ein Sof for its attributes.
Yeah, well, from a conventional point of view, we don't know what wisdom is. We have no clue, right? Do you remember? I don't know if you're too young for this or not, but in the 70s there was a book called Flatland.
No, I don't know it.
Okay, Flatland was a book where there were beings that existed two-dimensionally in this realm called Flatland, and they were told about a three-dimensional universe, but they absolutely could not comprehend it because the entirety of their processing system was based on a two-dimensional reality. That's all they knew. So they could be told about the three-dimensional realm infinitely, that they will not understand it. It is utterly beyond them. They're not equipped to understand it. Well, that's kind of like the conventional mind in relation to wisdom. We could be told about it. We could be presented with symbolic pictures of it, but we will never get it until we are no longer living in the flatland. Until we experience something beyond the dimensional parameters of what has set up everything since birth that we've ever processed. And our whole memory structure and our associative patterns are based off of whatever we've experienced and nothing more. Yeah. And that breakthrough is so precious and so vitally important that until even just a little taste of it, a little spark of it is imbibed from the living fountain of the source, we can only just make up fairy tales about it. Yeah. And that's it. So underneath this description of the Tzimtzum, I have this phrase that I like to repeat to myself. The field of perpetual renewal is enworlding mind. Now, if you think about it, the field, that's the field of your perception. Perceptual renewal is the fact that it's constantly new, constantly unique. And that's the Bereshis quality that I was talking about earlier, that the beginningness that is constant, where there is no static anything. It's a total dynamic field, right? Perpetually renewing itself. And that goes back to the interpretive responsiveness, because the interpretive responsiveness is always, it doesn't settle anywhere. It doesn't stop or start. We're making the world that we think is real right now, as well as the understanding of it. So that field of perceptual renewal is a mind that projects its own world. So what we think of as the worlds, the five worlds, is a projection of the mind, provided that we understand that the mind is not us. Is not just merely functions of consciousness. It's an absolute level of awareness that is co-equal with Ein Sof. And that's quite a difference.
Oh, yeah.
So let's go to the next image here. Okay, if you want to understand, let's bring this concept of the Tzimtzum, or our understanding of the ground, into the terms of the Sefirotic that people will be able to relate to. Go to the top of this diagram on the left-hand side here. I started out the very first episode that we did by saying that Ein Sof, which is pure open possibility, exudes its self-glow. It is naturally illuminated from its own nature. It doesn't spit out a light, because that would be quite dualistic. And that's the beginning of emanationism, if we think that Ein Sof creates or produces a light that then goes on to be reduced into steps and stages. It appears that way, but in essence, Ein Sof perpetually glows from its own essential dynamism. And that becomes everything that we know, as well as the means to know it. The Sefer Yetzirah says something very interesting about the qualities that come out of this, which are the Sefirotic. It calls them belima. And this is a really important word. Belima means without, beli, ma, something, without anything. So it can be translated as nothingness. And the Sefer Yetzirah says 32 paths of nothingness, or 32 paths belima. And this nothingness is not an absence, is not a void, because if it would be, then we would have yet more dualism where we have a nothing and then maybe a something that comes out of it. No, it's beyond something, nothing, positive, negative, presence, absence, beyond all of that. It's an essential fullness of possibility that is irreducible to any quality or attribute. And it becomes all attributes like a lightning flash. That's where I get the lightning flash imagery from Sefer Yetzirah. It is literally a spontaneous assertion outside time, outside space, outside of any parameters. It explodes like a lightning flash into its uniqueness. But the primordial quality that we have trouble with as human beings is the open possibility itself. Because we can think about things, a world of infinite things, and then we could even speculate about a void state or a nothingness. And these dualistic qualities of something and nothing, or nothing and everything, we could say, these are not going to help you in the mystical realm. Because if you dwell too much on nothingness in a dualistic sense, you become a nihilist, right? So how is that divine? Well, that open fullness, that pure, absolute superabundance of possibility, that is what we have to struggle with, because we have no trouble with ideas and things whatsoever. The mind can believe this or believe that. We don't have a problem with philosophy. We have a problem breaking through to its essence. And its essence is open, pure, possibilizing openness, unformed, undifferentiated. So the best way that we could say that we could understand the Sefirot is like kind of how I represented in this diagram here, which is the model for all the triads of the Sefirot. That open ground of Ein Sof is both the sun and the moon. The moon in terms of pure wisdom, undifferentiated capacity to divulge any and all qualities. And that's what we refer to as bright. Because it's bright in the cognitive sense, that when we know something that has a quality, it's bright in our perception. It's perceptually bright. But the limitation that differentiates it locks it into some mode that is dark because it restricts its possibility to just the parameters of what has been expressed. So light and dark are not what we think they are, these dualistic ends of the spectrum. Light and dark exist through each other in the display of reality essentially. And the interpretive responsiveness always conforms to some set of parameters. So what does this become, this openness that becomes both bright and dark, both becomes the sun and the moon? This is the model for the supernal triad. So this is the model in the Tzachzakot that becomes Keter, Chokmah, and Bina, but precedes it. And if we don't understand Keter, Chokmah, and Bina in this way, we'll reduce it to the common terms that people use to define the Sefirot, where they're qualities or planets or just merely that, which is not to say that that's wrong, but it's way more when the sublime qualities are investigated. And if we want to surrender our dot to Keter, and we want Keter to become a point of transparency, like a window through which the divine shines, so that all the qualities of the Sefirot take on new meaning, then we're going to have to consider the brightness of reality that is knowable. And the way that happens is by making breakthroughs where that undifferentiated potency sparkles through the flesh of things.
Mm.
And that sparkling resonance becomes incredibly, profoundly important in practice. And we're going to see some evidence of this from the book of Lambspring and through a couple other sources,
Mm-hmm.
where the point at which the mind surrenders and immerses in the primordial, that sparkling, scintillating quality takes over. And it's like an acid bath. It like literally eats through the ordinariness, the reified shells of the associative patterns and the networks that we've constructed. In other words, that acid bath of wisdom erodes the accumulated memory structure patterns, the shadows that we've assembled throughout the entirety of our lives ever since we were born.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't wipe away our memories, but it renders them into doorways, essentially. And we break out of prison, and that's the name of the game. And now, once we understand, and I'm going to show you some images that'll reinforce this, once we understand that the step-off point is a profusely scintillating, dissolving quality where the alchemy of our practice takes root, we actually have a model of these breakthroughs where the sparks that we've spoken about that are strewn throughout the worlds of that are referred to as the worlds of creation, those sparks are uprooted and ultimately they take over the entire perceptual field. And that's where the textured fields come out in our contemplation. That's where those textures can be apprehended in advanced practice. And it's very, very real. This is not a metaphor. This is not yet another symbol. When I'm talking about the profuse scintillation of mystical contemplation on the deepest levels, I'm talking about something that is experientially very real, but what's being eroded away is the very idea of experience itself, because there's no thing to be experienced and there's no experiencer anymore.
Mm-hmm.
There's no subject and there's no object. All there is an awakening of the ground. However, the falling into that is not automatic, like you're flipping a light switch.
Right.
And in that process, the process comes through these textured fields of scintillation. And those textured fields, and you're going to relate to this because of what you do in your work, they're etheric in nature.
Mm-hmm.
So what we're talking about is refining our etheric work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's super important. It's definitely it's certainly been interesting because there's certain levels of, I guess, as you're putting it, to sort of conform to the vernacular that we're using for this session. There's several gates of wisdom that need to be opened up to you before you can really effectively do that etheric work. And it's, it's always been present. For instance, in the theurgic context, they talk about it in terms of the luminous body and things like that. There's a lot of talk about light and fire in theurgy, and we're not talking about terrestrial fire, regular fire, elemental fire. We're talking about a spiritual fire, and yeah, it just kind of, at a certain point, it's like this spontaneous, when you go a certain length down the path, it's this thing that you inevitably confront, whether you believe in it or not, which is pretty interesting.
Well, that's what we're going to talk about next. The levels of that fire, because it starts as the vital force of the nefesh,
Mm-hmm.
and it becomes understood as etheric in the ruach portion
Mm-hmm.
of our consciousness. However, that requires the introduction of wisdom from the neshama.
Right.
So
Yeah.
until those two are integrated in the ruach, the nefesh and the neshama, we will be left with just our preconceptions and our associative patterns that were in the Ruach before we started, you know, the ordinary ones. So let's go to the next image. Okay, let's talk about some of these textured fields of dissolution that we're referring to, which are etheric in nature. Over on the left, I have 3 seals that are from several of my books, and they're pretty much what we've just been speaking about. On the bottom are the lower 9 Sefirot with an arrow going into the qualities of the 9 chambers. In other words, that 9-fold field expresses itself in terms of wisdom, in terms of primordial sublime qualities of wisdom. That's the goal. Above that, in the middle, that second sphere on the left, is that field of profuse scintillation that I've spoken about, the dissolving point, where all the life force that has informed the experience of reality throughout the lower 9 Sefirot is set loose, and that's on the level of Keter where it really reaches its highest point. Dot is surrendered. There's that collision that opens up Keter to the Tzachzakot, which pour down. Beyond that, on the top there is the crystallization of the qualities of the sun and the moon when they recrystallize in the heart and the meaning of reality changes. And we'll talk about the crystallization of the Aspeclaria at some future point. I think the emphasis for us to understand for people right here is more that middle phase where breakthroughs are made, and when they're really amplified to take over everything, the scintillation becomes absolute, it becomes complete, it swallows up the whole universe. And that's what we have represented in this image on the right, where I pretty much have summarized the view with 4 different dissolving states. We start in the upper left with an image of the Tzimtzum. And that's very important intellectually, because if we don't understand that, we're not starting from a point of view of paradox, the paradox of containment. We live in a world that appears contained. It appears finite. But we know, hey, it's infinite in nature. How do we reconcile this? Well, we can make the left turn into a dualistic system where infinite and finite and immanent and transcendent are at odds with each other, and that becomes a theology. And I don't know what people want to do with that, but that's not what I'm talking about. We have to face that paradox head on and plunge into that paradox. And a paradox is a paradox. It's not comprehensible. It's not something that you could, intellectualize perfectly. It doesn't fit into neat little boxes. You enter it and become swallowed up by it and surrender to it because your mind can't handle it. That's very important. Below that on the left-hand side is the form that it takes. Once we realize that there's this paradox of containment, we realize that it appears in terms of levels and steps and stages. The Hishtalshelus, the chain of the worlds that most occultists, esotericists, magicians are concerned with, presents itself in a hierarchy. I am in no way suggesting that that is not true. That is the way reality appears. And it has to be honored that way. In other words, that paradox that we're talking about has to be reconciled with the steps and stages of subtlety that appear. They're undeniable. However, we don't have to succumb to the lowest common denominator of the interpretation of that. We can interpret that hierarchy in a very different way than people think, while still using it. We could cut to the essence. We could cut to the highest while the hierarchy presents itself.
Right.
So how do we do that? Well, on the right-hand side, the upper right-hand side, we have those 4 olives there. That's a symbol that I use, which is essentially just a symbol of a quadrisected expanse with a heart point, right? And those 5 olives, that quadrisected expanse, is a way of talking about the sublime wisdom nature of phenomena, which is then used to decode the hierarchies of steps and stages that become your upward and downward reductionism, right? So why is it five? It's five because we have the cardinal points and the heart point where they meet. That is the basis of all the geometry I use in the structure called the Ibri gate that I've mentioned. But the fivefold derivation is more than that. It it goes into the five basic categories of phenomena that I always refer to as the five fives.
Mm.
We have the five elements, we have the five levels of the soul, we have the five worlds, we have the five aspects of reification itself, which are essentially substance and dimension and time and concept and being itself, which either is or is not.
Mm.
And then we have five purities, which are, that's another discussion for another time, how I characterize that. But it's essentially all of these elements understood in this post-apophatic gnosis, where the essential meaning of reality comes out and is transmitted no matter what arises. Meaning anything and everything expresses the wisdom at that point. And then the lower image I have here is just an image of that scintillation that annihilates the dualistic constructs at their root and in the process leaves phenomena in the wake of our grasping as a sparkling resonance that is the raw essentiality stripped bare. And that is something that happens in practice to the etheric field.
Mm.
The etheric field unclothes itself in meditation the deeper we go into it, and that quality spontaneously arises whenever it does by grace. It's not through personal effort. It's like we can't do that.
Oh, I love it. I love that you say that, man. People don't really like to hear that, but the grace is such a key component here. It's inexplicable, really.
Well, it's basically the idea that you can't do it
Yeah.
yourself. You
But somehow it happens. We don't know.
maybe.
Oh, yeah, exactly. When it does happen, it happens, and we're not sure why. So that has been a conundrum for me in my experience.
Well, we know a couple of things about it. We know that when it happens spontaneously
Hmm.
with a mind of its own. We can't force it, and any attempt to force it will make sure it doesn't happen.
Hmm.
And we can't conceptualize about it. Because if you start conceptualizing about it again, that'll make sure that it won't happen. So
Hmm.
when does it happen? I don't know. Will it happen? I don't know. And if it happens, what do we do? Well, you're on your own.
Right, exactly. The issue that I've had with some of these kinds of things is that it's not the conceptualization beforehand that screwed me up because I didn't. It's the having the experience and then needing to conceptualize it afterwards to explain it because it's providential and so like it has no rationale, but I need there to be a rationale, and then that kind of like it's sort of a way of attenuating what was once before radiant and ebullient and luminous. It's if we're using dramatic terminology, the conceptualization of it attenuates it. It's like slowing a rushing faucet down to a drip. So there's that post gnosis or post experiential conceptualization that I think a lot of Western people, a lot of Western ceremonialists will certainly struggle with after the fact if they are blessed enough to have that experience.
Well, this is where symbols like the sun and the moon from the Emerald Tablet become really, really important because if we use our understanding of the wisdom nature of the ground in a non dual way, meaning the sun and the moon are not opposed to each other, they're not even unified or brought together because how could they be unified? They were always already together. They
Mm.
were already inseparable from each other, even though they represent qualities that could be discerned separately in meditation. They are not separate qualities at any point during that discernment.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a pretty important thing. So if we look at it kind of like I suggested as dark luminosity and luminous darkness, then we're not talking about contrasts at all. We're talking about textures.
Mm.
And those textures have no names in language, but we know that they scintillate. That spontaneous arising of the profuse scintillation has various qualities and degrees, and that's how the levels of the tzachzachot are apprehended. And we know that they come on the backs of the ethers. And when I say back, I'm making a Kabbalistic distinction between the front and the back of something.
Mm.
Right? We'll get into what that means, but it's on the dark side of the ethers. Like the back would be the part that's facing you. The face of any construct is facing out into infinity. We can't see that. It's like Moses stands in front of the burning bush. Who should I send me? Ehya asher ehya. Only my back will be seen.
Mm.
Right? It's that concept there, that the face of God is not something the mind can have a coherent perception of. But you can indeed surrender to it. And that's a very different thing. So let's go to the next image here.
Sure.
Okay, let's look at some of the Lambspring images and talk about this post-apophatic amalgamation that crystallizes in the heart that we've spoken about.
Mm-hmm.
Lambspring is really a very interesting Hermetic text, originally part of the 17th century Hermetic Museum collection, very short text, anonymously written, engraved by Marion and DeBry in that great studio that engraved all those fantastic 17th century alchemical texts. And really what we're talking about are the last 4 images of the Lambspring cycle, which go back to that wisdom presence that communicates to us in the post-apophatic realization, the post-apophatic gnosis. And this is where the Agatha Diamond teacher, sage, youth/elder symbolism can become useful for us when we learn how to read these images. So let's just look at the images before I say anything about them. The big one on the left-hand side is the wisdom presence, is here symbolized as a wisdom figure, bearded wisdom figure with wings, to let you know that it is not just another human, but learns to fly through the ethers, you could say. Mm-hmm. The wings are taking flight, but the flight of the ethers, not physical flight. Mm-hmm. And what's on the left and right are these figures, the sun and the moon, the exact entities that we're talking about that characterize the tendencies of the ground. And they're elevated on the top of a mountain, looking down on the interaction of elemental forces that form the worlds, essentially. They're above it. They're beyond it. In other words, the wisdom figure has taken the prince, the son of the king. That's a symbol of the ruach. Mm-hmm. It's a symbol of the aspect of that within us which thinks and feels, right? And it's taken that ruach up to the pinnacle, into the territory that is co-emergent in terms of the pictorial space, mm-hmm. where the line of the sun and the moon intersects with it. Yeah. And that's the communication that we're talking about symbolically, provided that we don't turn that wisdom figure into another entity, which presupposes that we don't turn ourselves into a separate entity based on a body-mind appearance, which is not a body-mind denial. Mm-hmm. That's the image of the communication that we're talking about. So how do we do that? Well, Lambspring gives us a formula that is quite shocking and radical. And that's represented by the last 3 images of the cycle, starting on the top. You have the wisdom figure on the left, basically with arms outstretched saying, this is how you do it. And the practitioner, in the guise of the Ruach, the prince, is facing the king. Now, keep in mind, the Ruach, the prince, are the 6 middle Sefirot. Chesed, Gevurah, Tiferet, Nechzach, Hod, and Yesod. okay, in the normal tree that we have with the Sefirot in their descended positions.
Mm-hmm.
And the king, the father of the prince, is Keter. So what we're talking about here is the father, the king, with its mouth wide open. And what the text tells us is the king is going to swallow the sun, swallow the Ruach. Well, what's being swallowed here is the activity of the Ruach that culminates at Dot.
Mm.
And the sum total of it is going to be swallowed by Keter.
Mm.
I mean, think about that. When your Ruach is being swallowed by Keter, the Dot is the summary of that. And that's what's going to be digested by Keter to transform its restrictions. That's the collision that we're talking about, where Keter utterly and completely changes and moves from opacity to transparency. So the qualities of the Saksakot can emerge through that Keter. But first, your mind and your universe, as you know it, have to be swallowed up whole. I mean, is there anything more beautiful than that? So next to it, I have a seal, which is the seal of the Ibri Gate. Those are the four quadrants converging and interpenetrating with each other. All of space, all of time, every concept about it are being swallowed. Okay, going down to that middle image, this is where things get a little freaky. You have the king, the Keter, in bed. And what the text tells us is that the sun, the Ruach that it just swallowed, he's now sweating it out. And that sweat, the beads of sweat that pour out of the king, are the points of that profuse scintillation that we spoke of. And the scintillation is very interesting because it goes back to the Lurianic concept of the Nekudim, which is a far broader concept than we have time to really talk about today. But in the primordial phase of the Nekudim that's described in the Lurianic literature, if understood mystically, is the idea of a world of points. And the world of points are very interesting because each point, it's like the entire expanse of reality is filled with scintillation points. But each point is a Keter unto itself. This is literally the monad breaking apart into infinite pieces. Right? This is seen as a chaos state because there's no structure or differentiation or order in it whatsoever. It's the idea that if every point, meaning literally every possible point, was a Keter point, there would be no origin, no cessation, no differentiation, but there would be a barrage of dynamic activity. Well, that's a state in meditation that happens through profuse scintillation. That's when the ethers are breaking into a realization of their essentiality, and the whole of reality and all its life force that has been used throughout your life to construct a so-called ordered system that you think is real, that you think is true, that you think makes sense. I mean, think about it. If every law that has structured your universe from the time you were born is dissolved in mass, what would that be like? Well, it would have a lot of life force that had been liberated from its structures, and now you would have to contend with that. It's not going to be peaceful. It's not going to be smooth. It's not going to be warm and fuzzy. It's going to be the most disruptive moment of your life. And that's the king sweating out the ether of the sun. Now, the bed that the king is sitting on is Bina. That's the bed of basic space. That's that. Now, remember, Yud, Hey, Vav, Hey, Bina, and Malkuth are both Heys. So the bed displays the Malkut, but is the basic space of that display. That placeless place, because you can't put it anywhere, that primordial basic space is the bed of Keter, the bed of the king. That's where the sweating forth of the profuse inhalation takes place. And this is definitely something that happens in practice. I mean, that is one of the phases of mysticism that indelibly changes the nature of phenomena and its meaning permanently, which doesn't mean that reality doesn't appear the way that it always does, but its meaning shifts at that point. You lose something there, which is a rigidity. You lose a certain aspect of rigidity. You sweat through it, we could say. And then if you look at the image below it, the wisdom guide is sitting between the son and the father, the prince and the king, or the ruach and keter, and they're sitting on their thrones like equals. That's realization. That's what crystallizes. The operation is complete at that point. So before I explain Kabbalistically some different ways to look at this, I'm real curious what you might be thinking.
Well, there's certainly an alchemical component here that I'm seeing in terms of the symbolism, but it almost appears, the basic alchemical formula is solve et coagula, right? To take apart and then to put back together. And you have like an inversion of this where the solve actually takes place in the middle, because there's a union of the prince and the king, or the ruach and keter, as a union first. But that can also be kind of the nigredo, where it's like, well, this is what has to happen in order for this thing to break down, and then the dissolution, right? And the complete chaos, the breaking apart, and the sweating out of the prince reminds me of alchemical distillation and things like that. And then
Yeah, well, let's look at that for a second in mystical terms
sure.
before we get to alchemical about it in a formal sense.
Hmm.
If the cataphatic part brings us to that point that you're describing,
Hmm.
right? And then it goes through an apophatic release. That apophatic release is what informs what drops down to the middle,
Right.
right?
Right.
So there has to be a cataphatic part that gets us to that point.
Hmm.
There has to be an apophatic release which dispenses of a separation between what we thought of as cataphatic or experiential
Hmm.
and this level of non-experiential gnosis or trans-experiential gnosis,
Yeah.
right? And that apophatic part has to happen. And it's really the introduction into that becomes the profuse scintillation. And then once that information takes hold, once that shift happens, that's what drops down into the center and becomes post-apophatic.
Right. Yeah, like you were saying, that post-apophatic, and that's what's interesting too, because I actually that's not a term that you hear used, post-apophatic. So
Mm-hmm.
I can appreciate that, and the imagery here of the outcome of being. I think it's really important to show that like the prince doesn't necessarily become the king. The ruach doesn't, but then it in that post-apophatic moment, but it occupies a space that is sort of co-equal to it.
Mm-hmm.
And that I think that's really, really important for people to understand conceptually, because what I see a lot of happening in people that they understand this at a very topical level, and at a level where there's really no depth of phenomenology on their own part. It's just kind of all, again, like we were saying, it's all this mental castle, this struggling with an idea. I've seen people self-deify,
Mm-hmm.
and that is a massive danger, where they think now, okay, I'm the king, I am God,
Well, yeah.
and
Well, obviously, if the prince and the king are sitting in the presence of the wisdom figure, both seated on their thrones, then that's not what we're talking about.
right.
And the evidence of this is when you look at the wisdom masters who have stable realization or realization that is palpable and can be communicated, they're talking to us. They seem to be conceptualizing. They're in the world that we share. They haven't departed. They're not flying around somewhere. They're here with us.
Yeah.
So whatever level of that we can accomplish in our lives, which is a quiet, private, silent transformation, that ultimately has to seat itself back down in the phenomena of the realms that we share. It's not elsewhere. Where else is there to go? There's nothing up there.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is why the post-apophatic wisdom that is communicated, I think, settles back down in the heart of the tree. And this is where Tiferet and Yesod become amalgamated, because the life force rises from the Nefesh through Yesod until the point that that breakthrough is made in an apophatic release. And the wisdom of that apophatic release comes down to meet it once dot ceases to be a barrier. And it comes down through the aspect of the outpouring of phenomena, which is Tiferet, the beauty aspect. And then the imaginal power and the life force that has come up through Yesod, which is really very essential to our inner sensorium and our capacity to perceive, that becomes integrated with that beauty. And the Aspaklaria, the philosopher's stone, is an amalgamation or a crystallization of that amalgamation, where Tiferet and Yesod merge with each other. Beauty and apprehension become a single thing in the heart of reality, or the heart of a human being. And that's very different than the latter concept, where we're climbing and climbing and climbing and get to the top. No, that's only a cataphatic conceptualization of a linear tree. Ultimately, something crystallizes in the heart of it all, based on what has been released and has informed us. And that crystallizes beyond linear conception. So when you look at the rising into the state where we're growing prior to these breakthroughs of ultimate release, they come through Yesod, and the divine name of Yesod is Shaddai, as you know. And that shares this really important gematria with the presence of that wisdom force of Metatron. That the name Metatron and the divine name of Yesod, 314, show an equalization. Well, what does that tell us? Well, what it tells us is that what is rising through Yesod and the wisdom that it ultimately attaches to become synonymous with each other, become a single force, and that's evidence of that amalgamation taking place. That's a pretty important connection to make. But I think the only way that that's going to happen is if we don't reify that wisdom, or the communication of that wisdom, into a being, an angel, a figure, which means that we're not doing it with ourselves either. And then the wisdom of essentiality can communicate, because that's what the field of the ethers, that's the repository of their treasure, communicating itself to us. And we either realize that or we don't.
Yeah, that's brilliant. That perspective regarding the ethers and the communication.
So the post-apophatic state is the use of the entire tree. Really, it's not like we're rising it incrementally to escape it,
right,
in any kind of a way. No, that's a necessary stage.
Right.
But ultimately, all the liberation in the world has to seat itself down in phenomena.
Right.
For phenomena to ultimately be understood profoundly. And then the world is just fine as it is.
Yeah, there's something that especially here, looking at in like, almost like triptych form here, with this threefold vertical symbolism. I don't know why it keeps popping into my head, and I'm like, okay, maybe I shouldn't say this because it's too far off track, etc. But it's sticking in my head, and there's something here that is reminiscent to the idea of, okay, the individual, the practitioner, let's say, has to go through this process, right? And it does seem somewhat alchemical, but not in a necessarily laboratory alchemical way per se. There's Do you think that there is a correlation to this that has something to do with the teleological, I guess, aspect of the universe? And I know it's really tough to say, like,
Well,
what.
what do you mean?
Well, it's just kind of interesting that, like, I see a lot of patterns here. That not only I see the threefold pattern and this development, kind of almost like an evolution of consciousness, not Darwinian, but more alchemical. And I see that how it is represented to the individual, the practitioner, the microcosm. But I can't help but think that there is some, you know, corollary to all this on the macrocosmic level, that the macrocosm being, like, kind of how you pointed out, this bed, this space. It reminds me of the vault, really, because I'm a Golden Dawn guy, but also a Rosicrucian. The bed reminds me of the vault of Christian Rosenkreuz, or the tomb of Christian Rosenkreuz. So
Yeah, from the Fama.
yeah, so and he says, in it, I've built this as a replica of the universe for myself. So to me, that's a mirror between the microcosm and the macrocosm, and it's like, okay, I know it's almost impossible to answer, but the teleology of it, meaning the teleological purpose of this vast machine of which we are a part, which is the illusion of separateness in the material universe, might be, exactly, it might be the grounds by which the opportunity to specifically accomplish exactly this.
Yeah, well, the Emerald Tablet says that. I mean, in its various translations, in its various forms, it says the work is the work of above and below and the realization of the one thing,
Hmm.
and it's the interaction of the sun and the moon that facilitates that realization. So, provided that we understand what is being implied by macro and micro, or above and below, so to speak, in their own way,
Right.
and provided we understand what we mean by one thing as not being a reified monad, yes, ultimately, the work of both microcosm and macrocosm is to put themselves out of business. So that, yes, they appear macro and micro, but ultimately those are not solutions to the question.
Hmm.
There is no micro or macro solution to the dilemma of the paradox of containment.
Right, which is why we have to come down, so to speak, again, the
Yeah,
post-apophatic. It's because it's all one work.
that's true, because when you do come down, what's the question of identity going to use to solve itself? Is it body mind as identity, or is it universe as identity? Well,
Right.
neither one. And it's not the sum of both either. It's something utterly beyond the distinction, and that's a pretty major shift. That is the miracle of the one thing that the Emerald Tablet is suggesting for us.
Mhm.
So the Emerald Tablet actually leads us to that conclusion, but doesn't spell it out,
Yeah. Well,
which
we've
is
talked,
interesting.
and it is interesting because we've talked about the Kabbalistic texts, and they don't necessarily spell things out either, but
No, no, nothing does.
nothing does. And it's the same thing with the Platonic dialogues. You sit there and you're like, oh, the answers aren't in here. What I'm supposed to be doing is mimicking the dialectic taking place in the text about the text.
Yeah, what you're supposed to do is work the path that's being laid out by these suggestions.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because if they just told you, it wouldn't make any sense anyway.
Right. Yeah.
So you have to figure it out yourself, because the transmission will not communicate it to you in a way that will make any kind of sense ever to discursive conceptuality. It's a mystery that has to be experienced to go beyond experience. So let's go to the next image here. Okay, this is a sort of a summarization of some of the things that we've said. There's the cataphatic work below that comes up through Malkut, through Yasod, in the way that we've managed to understand, breaks through at Keter, and then what is realized supernally pours down through Tiferet. So first there's the cataphatic ascent, the descent of apophatic wisdom, should that breakthrough have been apprehended. And where they meets literally through the textures, the etheric textures of reality and its mode of display and presentation. The ethers are not elsewhere. That's the inner life of the universe revealing itself right wherever we are, you know. And I don't like to, tout any experiences or whatever I had in practice, because I think it becomes misleading and pretentious to do so. But when I did my 3-year retreat, solitary, silent 3-year retreat, I did it in an apartment in Brooklyn. And what called me into it was the fact that the universe has an inner life. And I could think about it all I want, but I'm a friggin' tourist until I go in there. And it takes a really long time to go there. No. Life of the ethers. Did you get that, or did I drop out?
Dropped out just for a second.
Okay. To take up permanent residence in the inner life of the ethers and to not be a tourist, the inner life has to call to you. And then you make a plea to that inner life to accept you, because it's not necessarily just going to accept you because you feel like going in there. No, this is an arduous task that it calls to you. Hey, something is possible. And then you have to plead, well, I want this more than anything else. And then the two have to connect with each other. And that's very much like that cataphatic trajectory going up and the apophatic trajectory coming down. It has to call to you, and then you plead to it, and then the doors might open. But you don't control that process. That's the grace that we're talking about. In a sense, your acceptance into the ethers is none of your business.
I like that. And it's very reminiscent to what the outward form of Western initiatory ceremonial is attempting.
Yeah, like you're going to bully your way in like Teddy Roosevelt going up the hill,
No, we've got swords in here.
yeah, we got this, we got that. We're dressed up, we're going to theatrically enact it, and by God, that'll do the trick.
Yes. Well, and a lot of time, but that's the thing. A lot of the times, like for me, it happened before I joined any initiatory order, which is why I'm able to speak insightfully on the symbolism and meaning of those initiatory orders, because I had the experience before I kind of, went in and got involved in esotericism. So it's like, yeah, it's to me, it's kind of obvious that there's an internal, like you say, there you are pleading, you are begging, really, and there's a sincerity behind it that cannot be faked. And it's in the heart. Really, it's in the heart. It's not even in the mind. It's what it is. It's the mind giving up because I can't drive this car. Every time I drive the car, I end up in the ditch. So the heart screams, save me.
That's why it has to settle back into the heart finally to crystallize. Yeah. Like we've said, that's where the amalgamation of Tiferet and Yesod take place. And the other thing about when the ethers call to you with the promise of the inner life of reality, and you have no way of knowing whether that is going to happen or how it's going to happen or what's going to happen at all. But there is a sense, at least there was for me when I went into retreat, there's a sense that the promise is, this is sort of your wedding night. This is the promise of an engagement that will reach its consummation in a way that will make it complete. And that experience of a total union is what's on the table. And even though you haven't realized it, you know that that's what's on the table. It's like it's this or nothing. And if that doesn't become the most important thing in your life, then you can't do it,
Yeah.
you know? And really, the rest of it is just a negotiation with those textured fields of etheric presence sparkling through the pretense of ordinary objects and states that we think is reality. That when you look at the world around you, what does this all mean is the question. Well, once you go deep enough, there's a seepage that comes through the skins of those shells, whispering that meanings and levels of meaning are possible beyond anything that you could speculate about. And that seepage, it on a certain at a certain point it wants you there. And you take 2 steps towards it, it takes 4 steps towards you. Right? But before that happens, there has to be some kind of acceptance and commonality that you're playing for keeps. And these are various stages, but once you get to the point where you're all in, it's just a matter of incrementally feeling out those textured fields through the appearances of things, the superficial appearances of things. And everything in your mind, all the associative patterns and the memories, they just have to get out of the way. And part of what is dissolving into that state of profuse scintillation is those ordinary skins breaking up and discharging their life force into the ethers and becoming purely etheric. And all the qualities of the Sefirot, the qualities of the red and white drops, which are Chesed and Gevurah, the integration of those qualities in Yesod, the thinking and feeling through them in Hod and Netzach, and their display in whatever form they assume, all of that becomes an ocean of the way that the field displays itself or appears to you. So then you start seeing in terms of the Sefirot very directly. It's no longer a correspondence table. It's no longer a symbol. That's literally how reality communicates. And then the tree comes to life. And then you don't have to think about it anymore.
Yeah.
That's when you actually become a Kabbalist.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, so that kind of releasing of the ethers from this, their skins or their shells reminds me almost of the rescuing of the divine presence from the klipot, the tikkun haolam. I don't know if the two are related.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But in the rescuing of it, the shells themselves are dissolving. And the dissolution of those, I mean, think about what's in a shell, life force that's been packaged there. Well, what happens when those packages start to dissolve? It liberates the life force. And then it just hangs there. Well, then what happens? Well, a whole lot of stuff depending on the interpretive responsiveness of your mind. Like once the life force discharges itself from the shells and the shells break up, they cease to be shells, but they're still sort of in the twilight of being shells. And that's what's called the klipa noga, the semi-permeable membrane, the in-between state.
Okay.
And in the state of the klipa noga, they're still functioning as shells, but they're permeable. And there's passage possible in and out of them. And the klipa noga is not one state. It's a transitory realm of exchange.
Wow.
Right. And that's at its peak where the profuse scintillation happens. Now,
Wow.
what's scintillating are the qualities of the sun and the moon really interacting with each other because they're still very, very subtly separate. And there's friction and tension involved in them. So that's why the scintillation happens. Hopefully that's not too abstract for people.
No, I think it's I mean, that's the first time I've ever heard that klipa noga. So I mean,
Oh yeah, there's different words for it. Like the klipa noga There's other terms for it once it goes through its stages, its various levels. On the highest possible level, once transparency is introduced to it, it's referred to as the crystal seat.
Hmm.
And that's when it really becomes transparent. And that's like one step away from some crystallization happening where the Aspaklaria is formed, the philosopher's stone.
Hmm.
So let's go to the next image here. Oh boy. Okay. Now, when I speak about Metatron as a wisdom field that communicates, I have to be very, very careful. Ooh, you there? You dropped away. Oh, there you
Yeah,
are.
sorry. I got to take this thing. I didn't want to do it on camera, but it's like for GERD. So,
Okay. All right. So bear with me here. Okay. Once you start talking about Metatron, the assumptions just run wild and people are going to hear whatever they hear. But when wisdom speaks, it doesn't speak to us, it speaks through us. So, provided that you understand that wisdom is essential and there's nobody there talking to you, then you realize there's nobody in us that is listening. Wisdom is just communicating itself through the rumor that there was once in us.
hmm.
Okay? And this is the invitation of the whispering, the silent speech of the ethers. So what I have here on the screen are seals associated with the wisdom field as Metatron, and the call to Metatron that I published a book on and that I use. It's a bizarre formula. I could go through it, and the reason why it's viable is because I used it in practice and it helped me a lot. So I give it out to others if they want to use it. I don't know what they're going to do with it, but it pertains to my own practice. And the call is Matat, and Matat is a name of Metatron. It's actually used in the Hasidic world. They call Metatron Melech Matat.
Hmm.
Amatat Shaddai, and remember the Gematria 314.
Hmm.
And then that end part is very interesting because there's a magical term, Aleph Tav, pronounced Et, in the Torah, and especially in the first part of the first several chapters of Genesis in the creation scenario. It's not a word, and there's no literal translation. What it is the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet and the last letter of the
Right.
Hebrew alphabet conjoined with each other. So Et becomes like a synopsis of wholeness. It brings you back to the view. So it's Amatat Shaddai Et We start and end with the Aleph. But when you take the Et and the final Aleph and you read them together, it sounds like Atah.
That's you. Yeah.
Yeah, but what's the you? It's like there is no you. So the Aleph Tav is the you. It's the sum total of wholeness. So Amatat Shaddai Atah Et Ah. And this call, if it's repeated over and over again, and you understand, at least intellectually, that you're facing the field of phenomena and you're going into it texturally through the ethers, it's a fantastic way to open the gates of those ethers. And then the breakthroughs, I don't want to say that they allow you to become Metatron, but they do. They do allow you to become Metatron, provided that there's no notion of either you or Metatron left.
Hmm. It's really interesting too, because I know that one of the Hebrew words for wisdom is or truth is emet,
Yeah.
which kind of looks like emetet that you're that we've got, or ametet that we've got right here.
Yeah, well, that's a really interesting word to dissect on its own for another time. But yeah,
Yeah.
right, because it's got the mem in there. So let's go to the next one here.
Got it.
Okay. Now here's a synopsis of everything that we're talking about. On the left, you have the lower nine Sefirot without a Keter, and the Keter becomes the Ibri gate. That's the passage point. The Ibri gate is the concept of passing through. Ibri literally means passing through, passing over, passing through. And at the heart of the representation of the Ibri Gate here, what I have are the phases of the moon. Because if
Yeah.
you're viewing the moon as wisdom in its capacity to communicate, the phases of the moon become tremendously important. Because what is the moon doing when it goes through those phases? Well, what the moon is doing, and we have 8 phases, this relates to the geometry of the 9 chambers and so forth, but that's for another time. The more important issue is the phases of the moon are appearing and disappearing, which is really what phenomena does in the perceptual field. It arises, it dissolves, it coagulates, it dissipates. It's there, but then it's not there. It's present, but it's absent. What we're transcending with non-dual gnosis is this idea of yes and no, of being and non-being. So what happens when you pass through the gate of Keter and this Gnostic transparency is evoked is this idea that you're passing beyond the ultimate contrast of being and non-being to realize something that cannot be reduced to those terms anymore. What the Emerald Tablet calls the miracle of the one thing is non-dual, is beyond contrast. It cannot be held prisoner by presence and absence anymore, by being and non-being anymore. And this is why Hermetic Kabbalists in particular should really consider not referring to Ein Sof or the Or Ein Sof as a negative limitless light, using terms like negative and positive to characterize essentiality. Because that's what you're going beyond. If you call it a negative limitless light and creation becomes positive, you're back to duality again. You're back to discursive, dualistic conceptualization again.
That's true. And it's ultimately a product of the mind, because I think that the negativity that it's referring to is not necessarily having to do with non-being, but having more to do with apophaticism, which is describing it in negatives.
Yeah, that's
Right?
why
Limitless, not
right.
breakable.
Well, the language and the symbolism is not wrong. It's the interpretation of it that becomes wrong.
Exactly. Because we get mired in our systems and we only half understand them anyway. But
Right.
and what else is interesting too about the inclusion of the lunar phases, which I really love that I like how you point out that the natural phenomena are essentially analogs of these abstract principles.
They have to be.
They have to be. That's what everything's predicated on. But
right.
They also relate, I think, importantly, at least in the work that I do on it, they definitely relate to the ethers.
Of course, because what do the ethers do? They appear and they disappear.
Right. They swell and there's an ebb and a flux, ebb and flow to them.
That's right. So think about what happens if you get caught up in the appearance of the ebbing and flowing of the ethers. Well, if you become too caught up in it and you reify it, you miss the transcendent essentiality that is speaking through that language. You miss it completely, and you just get caught up in expansion and contraction patterns.
Yeah, and very appropriate for this analogy regarding the moon from that Bruce Lee quote. Don't get caught up and don't ignore the finger that points to the moon. Otherwise, you will miss all that heavenly glory.
Wow, he must have said that right before he beat the crap out of somebody.
He did. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's in the beginning of Enter the Dragon.
So if you pass through the Ibri Gate and presence and absence are no longer keeping you out, then what you realize are the wisdom qualities in the 9 chambers, which we spoke about before and, can really look at in more detail at some later point. But that's what is going to be realized, those primordial wisdom qualities, those sublime attributes. Now, what that does is represented by this image on the right, where you have a giant circle defined by the interaction of light and dark.
I love
right?
it. This is a stunning image, by the way, that contrast.
Yeah, well, what's happening here, I described to a certain degree in a book that I wrote called Black Ether. And what is rising up from that sphere that is contained by dualistic contrasts is represented by a fire triangle. And that rises and rises and rises. Okay, do you see on the top there?
Yes. Yep.
And beyond it, uncontained by the circle, is the sum total of infinite possibility,
Mm.
right? We could say that the upward trajectory and the downward trajectory meet at the cusp of the circle, the periphery of the circle, which to the circle, from the standpoint of the circle, that's the Keter point.
Mm-hmm.
So what is beyond the circle is Tzachzakot. What is contained within the circle is Sefirot, and they meet at Keter, which is exactly what we have on the left here. Now they integrate with each other in the form of the hexagram. You with me so far?
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
Okay. When that point where the transcendent and the immanent, let's call it, where they meet, from that point back down into the circle, that's the aspect Kabbalistically of a vessel that we call the back. From that point out into unformed infinity, that's the aspect Kabbalistically that we call the front.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's got to be a point with any contract, any construct, whether it be a thought or a feeling or the Tzimtzum of all the worlds themselves. So we don't have to go to the grandest possible macro model
Mm-hmm.
to talk about that point. We could talk about it like you're having a thought right now, a thought of a specific thing. That's a mental construct. What's beyond that thought? The pure possibility in which it sits. What's inside that thought? Well, the thing in and of itself, as Marcus Aurelius would say,
Mm-hmm.
right? So where is the point with any mental construct that what's in the construct and what's beyond the construct meet? Where do they meet? They meet at the cusp of, just like that image that we have of the winged wisdom figure with the image of the prince on the mountaintop. That's the Keter point. That's the ultimate point where the decision is made between opacity and transparency.
Mm-hmm.
And you could find that point. You could live for that point if you hold the highest view. In any network of associative patterns, if you find that point, you unlock the entire field. Because if you, this is the amazing thing, if you find that point where the back and the front meet of any particular construct, you unlock that point in every construct. That's a wild thought, but
Yeah.
try it. Try to find the point of non-dual immersion with any particular thing. And what you find is that it affects the entire field. So if you find it anywhere, it's applied everywhere. Not permanently,
Right.
but that's how a breakthrough happens. That's the spark of the world of points.
Yeah. That's a really good description of a breakthrough, actually.
Yeah, well, that's what's being represented in this image that we're looking at here. And symbolically, that's where the fire triangle and the water triangle are integrated into each other if you understand their ultimate repercussions. It undoes or unmakes the skin of a shell, the skin of a klipa.
Mm.
And if you could do it, like I said, with any particular klipa, you do it with every part of every network across the, basically you unmake infinite realms at that point.
Yeah. That's incredible.
And I call that breakthrough black ether because it is etheric, but it's the hidden most secret point of what is apparent.
Mm.
It's the black ether that seeps through and saturates light itself. And the light that we're talking about is the perceptualizing light, the cognitive light,
Right.
awareness.
Yeah.
Because think about this, Mr. Ike Baker. What does awareness do when there is neither a subject to be aware nor an object to be aware of?
Well, if I'm thinking of my time in the sensory deprivation tank, it makes pictures in the imagination.
Right. Well, but those are objects still.
Right. Yeah.
So on a subtle level, now beyond subtle and gross, okay, so in the sensory deprivation tank, you've cut through gross levels of body-mind identification and sensory, the imputing of sensory data on phenomena and all that. Okay, so you broke through the gross ones, so you're floating in the subtle ones
Hmm.
in the sensory deprivation tank, but the same law applies on the subtle level. So
Right.
if you keep upping the ante, up it, up it, up it, up
Yeah.
it, regardless of whether it's subtle or gross, the pure awareness itself, which is chashmal,
Hmm.
right? The subtle awareness, which is pure chaya,
Hmm.
right? What on the level of pure wisdom, pure chaya, pure awareness, it's not you and it's not other than you. It's certainly not personal experience, but it's not impersonal either.
Right. Yeah. It's not Ike for sure.
It's not Ike. It's not
But
other than Ike.
somehow I'm still here.
That's
Yeah.
right. So, what does that awareness do when there is nothing to be aware of?
Yeah.
Well, what does it mean to be aware of nothing? Well, dualistically, that's the paradox. That's the conundrum. Because that's the wisdom that is communicated where you get swallowed by the king
Mm.
and the king sweats you back out, giving reality new meaning,
Mm.
if that makes sense. So let's go to the
Yeah.
next image here because we got some more interesting stuff here. Okay. On the top here, I give you a little synopsis of what I just said, going from left to right with those circles on the top. Number one, we have a circle. We've got the space around the circle. From the periphery of the circle into the circle, we have the aspect of the back. This is like pure technical Kabbalah, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
From the point of the periphery of the circle out into the unknowable, we have the front. You shall not see the face of God and live.
Right.
Basically, it's Moses in front of the burning bush. So every mental construct, which is a klipa, basically, which is a reified vessel, is constructed habitually into a state of containment. And then it is added to the networks of associated patterns that we've accumulated. Lo and behold, we're stuck, right? So then we go to the one in the middle, the one next to it. Rather than having front and back face out from the surface of the circle, what happens when they face towards each other and we find the point at which they touch? Well, that's where the fun starts. Because that's where you can, I don't want to say erase the circle because the circle never goes away, but it changes its meaning from opacity to transparency.
Mm-hmm.
At the Keter point, that's the periphery of the circle. So the one on the third one, that's the one that I really want to talk about with you right now. This is where it gets interesting. When you find that point where the back and the front meet, the two hays, Bina and Malkut, are realized as the same space,
Mm.
right? That you have a supernal space, which is beyond what you can perceive. And then you have the immanent space of everything that you do perceive.
Mm-hmm.
At the point where you realize the convergence and the equality of those two hays, the Yud Hey Vav Hey, the Hey of Bina, the Hey of Malkut, awareness without any object, including itself, which becomes the subject. Okay, when awareness doesn't have any more objects to perceive, it doesn't take itself for an object, which becomes an identity of a subject.
Mm-hmm.
It conquers all of space. It becomes literally all of space. Now, the space of the apparent immanence is what your nefesh vitally feels. But that very same space becomes the supernal space of the neshama. When they commingle with each other to whatever degree that they do, you get the entire middle six sefirot of the tree coming alive as the ethers.
Mm.
That becomes the inner life of phenomena. But think about what happens with these two hays when they're realized as as the one thing, as the Emerald Tablet says. Well, a hey and a hey is a yud. That's the yud of wisdom. That's the yud of the chaya. That's the chashmal. That's pure awareness. So you find this through the interpretive responsiveness of space, the space of the world and the space of the mind. When they're realized as a single space, awareness is found, but it's not doing anything. And awareness is bright. But think about like brightness in terms of, metaphor, like a simplified metaphor from physics. We only see light when it hits something or bounces off of something.
Mm-hmm.
So what is light in and of itself when it's not bouncing off of a surface? It'd be dark. But not merely dark.
Yeah, no, I get it. It's not shadow. It's just it's in the same way that we call it kind of dark matter. We're not really seeing it. It's not really there. It's not fully expressed.
That's right. It only is expressed dualistically when it hits something, the surface of something, and the surface of something is a klipa. In this metaphor.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
You see, I've abstracted even the idea of klipa with actual discrete, material phenomena for a second there.
When I was studying with the Hasidim, like this one Hasidic rabbi, and he was teaching me about the klipas, there used to be this commercial in the 80s for some bathroom cleaning product, the scrubbing bubbles.
Yeah, I remember that.
Well, that's how he described the klipas to me. They're like little bubbles with mean faces that scrub around, And I was thinking to myself, well, that's not right. That's what you think, maybe.
Yeah.
But I didn't say anything. But the idea that there is a realm of the shells that's somehow under everything and it's evil, and that's what separates good and evil. Well, I would rather think that a klipa is just any act of reification solidified into a construct, which includes our thoughts about God, it includes any reified thought, even a really holy one. So what happens when you worship a conceptualized memory pattern that amalgamates? Well, in biblical terms, that's idolatry.
That's exactly what I was going to say. Idolatry, blasphemy.
That's right. So if ordinary perception is idolatry, whoa, all of a sudden, your ordinary perception is a serious problem unless you transform it. And like we said, we don't want to throw it away. We want to change its meaning. So how do you do that?
Yeah, you want to change the idol into the icon kind of thing,
Yeah, and how do you do that? Well, here, like below those three circles, I have this statement, right? And this is kind of like what happens in practice. Now, remember, the theme of this episode is understanding practice. So here's a practice scenario. Awareness settles through the field that it has projected through interpretive responsiveness, right? That your mind projects a field and you think that's a real world and that you're in it. But when we realize what's going on, we realize that our interpretation of reality is the field that we are projecting because of our mental habits. And it's not actually like that. We're just interpreting it like that. The actual reality of it has no form whatsoever. Okay, so if awareness in meditation can settle through the field that it has projected just as it is, its power bathes in and actually meets what from our perspective we would call unconsciousness. And that's really interesting because that's what psychedelic drugs do. They allow something that is formally held behind the iron curtain of your mind to become accessible. Now, usually what happens is that degenerates into a sort of meandering, indeterminate state that is visionary and hallucinatory with psychedelic drugs. But what happens if you discipline that that meeting point in practice day after day, year after year, and you actually start to get good at it.
Mhm.
Well, what happens is that you're sending awareness, which is bright by nature, into the darkness of its own nature. And that integration of the light within the darkness comes out etherically through these textured fields that have these various qualities, the qualities that the fountain of wisdom describes, with streams that coagulate into drops and are integrated with each other and join and spread so that the entire perceptual field becomes what the fountain of wisdom calls a foam of streams and drops and mixing and exchanging, right? And entering into that visionary etheric universe is something that happens in the midst of the world just as it appears to be. You don't have to go anywhere. You don't even have to close your eyes. It happens with the currents of perception.
Mhm.
So here's a little interesting formula, and this is something that I really want to talk to you about. That, like we said, the two hays of the back and front together make a yud, and that's the awareness principle. That's the chashmal, right? Where the space of the mind, which is bina, and the space of the display, which is malkut, are brought to their essential dynamism. That's awareness. That's the chokmah. That's the wisdom. What happens if you let that settle into the unconsciousness? Well, within your own brain, let's talk about it in physiological terms. The brain has an envisioning functional portion called the occipital lobe. It's in the back of the brain. When you look at something, you see it, you have a retinal impression through the eyes, goes through the optic nerve, shoots to the back, and you actually see it back here. You're not seeing it out here, you're seeing it back here.
Right. Yeah.
But that's the same thing that happens when you visualize something.
Mhm.
When you visualize something, it registers in the occipital lobe. There is a letter, a Hebrew letter, that bears the correspondence of the back of the head, the
Mhm.
kuf. Okay? I have one here on the screen.
Mhm.
Now, that's a little picture of the occipital lobe and the spinal column. You with me?
Yep. Yeah.
Okay. So,
Circling it with my cursor so that the audience sees it.
yeah, there is something that happens internally in the brain when you practice this way and you look at the world and you send an impression to the back of the brain that registers. And the tarot card associated with the kuf, at least in most systems, is the moon.
Mhm.
So the moon has like all this evolutionary symbolism, usually a crawfish climbing out of the water and so forth. And, without getting into the whole tarot thing,
Mhm.
but there's something that happens when the light of awareness settles into the darkness of unconsciousness in the back of the brain.
Mhm.
That happens. And what this does is it trains you to stop seeing this way
Mhm.
out the eyes, even while you're seeing out the eyes. And you send the impulse back and you settle into it. This is a practice. And there's various practices that use this dynamic. One particular version is that you start in the heart, usually from spinning in rotation and activating the heart, and you draw with a breath, right? Etherically up the central channel, which you can do by breathing, and release it out the eyeballs. Like you hold it in the heart, and you could even intone the ah, right? The aleph sound. Ah, hold it right here between the eyes, and then project it out the eyeballs and
Mhm.
let it settle throughout the perceptual field. At that point, when you settle into it completely, it's akin to what happens when the impulse of what you think you saw settles in, released into darkness in the back of the occipital lobe. It spreads into what is utterly beyond. And
Mhm.
that's the third ah. Ah. That whole practice takes like 5 seconds, but it creates a total break with normative patterns of thinking that you are a being that is seeing stuff.
Mhm.
And it's a really good etheric practice. So what happens, this is the really wild thing, is that another Hebrew letter is brought into question, because just as the kuf is the back of the head, the resh is the face of the front of the head. So it shines like the sun tarot card, but in a totally different way if this operation is made complete. Now, all of this that I just described with the back of the head and the central channel and the eyeballs, for most people, that will be neither here nor there. But what's being approximated is exactly what happens where the front and the back of the circle collapse the divisions.
Mhm.
That's what we're doing it for.
Mhm.
We're doing it to realize that black ether that I described.
Right.
These are just techniques. And ultimately, and this is the part that people don't understand that needs to be articulated, ultimately, we step beyond theories and techniques. And the whole of perception just becomes your practice.
Mhm.
And that's, you could say that there's a formal aspect of practice and there's an informal aspect of practice. But what happens when practice becomes so intense that formal and informal don't even begin to describe what is happening to you? And everything you do becomes prayer.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. It's a way of being in the world,
Right.
way of at least being and perceiving the world.
The way you do anything is the way you do everything.
Right.
So
That's
let's
our
go to,
motto for today. I love that.
yeah, for today. Yeah. So let's go to the next one here.
There we go.
Okay. Yeah. So the Ruach, I mean, you've done so much work with the ethers
Mhm.
that, especially in this conversation, we should really address the Ruach and what it does etherically.
Etherically.
Yeah.
Okay.
What it does is it causes the vital life force and the imaginal power to commingle with each other and be used on the root level. And of course, the Ruach contains both of these aspects. There is life force, it's definitely alive,
Mhm.
and it is imaginal in the sense that it envisions forms by its nature. It's envisioning power. And when the two are combined with each other, we have life force and envisioning power, we get, boom, reality. So what does the Ruach do? It shapes reality.
Mhm.
The ethers are the currents of that shaping. It's just as simple as it is. But when you really want to use it in practice, you're bringing the space of that vitality on the Malkut level into a realization of the highest root of the imaginal power, which comes from that interpretive responsiveness of the neshama, right? The interpretive responsiveness of the space of Bina is integrated on a root level with the power of your imagination.
Mhm.
And they mix in the Ruach, they mix in the ethers. And that's where those winds exchange in the visionary
Mhm.
intermediary, in the in between realm where practice is done, where magic is done. And that's where perception becomes magical and all the magical work
Mhm.
as well. So I would imagine you have something to say about this.
Well,
You're an etheric guy.
yeah, I mean the thing that's to be honest, the main thing that's kind of just like smacked me in the face just now is particularly in the Golden Dawn system and derivative systems, we view the Ruach, right? Those the sort of the lower Sefirot, um, in a planetary configuration in the hexagram, right? So you've got in Chaldean order, you've got the planets. We take Saturn to be, we place it at Doth on the tree as an outer face of the supernal triad, being Bina, the form of it, right? Regardless of why we do that or whether or not it's correct or incorrect, or that's just the way we organize it. The ruach of the microcosm, right? We were a small universe. And so we use these 7 planets from Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, the Sun, Venus, Mercury, and the Moon. The Sun is in the midst, right, occupying the place of Tefereth. You talked about how that kind of brings together the perceptual order, and in the ancient worldview, that's what the planets did. Where for instance, when the demiurge in Plato's Timaeus makes the moving image of eternity, right? The blueprint upon which everything's going to be made. What he's really making is the paradigm of time. And so the first thing that he does is he creates the terrestrial equator and the celestial ecliptic. Remember those two, the circuits are the same and the circuits are the different. He puts them together because the ancients, they didn't have, digital watches and their main idea of time and change, not only on a diurnal level, but an annual level and a really seasonal level, had to do with the movements of the planets. So it's just really, that was really striking to me that yes, the Ruach conceptualized as these planets brings perceptual order the same way that the planets in the ancient worldview brought order to the universe. So that kind of smacked me in the face because I never thought of it that way before, ever. But
Well, think about the first thing that you said when you described those planets, that Dot becomes a proxy essentially for Bina as Saturn.
right.
And what is the issue of the expanse of space on a supernal level in Bina? It's the issue of, will it restrict itself to a display, or will that space of the restriction be known as more than that?
Right.
So it's both.
Right.
And the fact that it is both is why it's Yud Hey in Bina, Vav is the middle 6, Hey in Malkut, because that space of Bina that restricts itself in this Saturnian mode becomes the display of Malkut.
Mm-hmm.
So if you realize that the space of the display and what's projected as the display, Bina and Malkut respectively, are the same space, that's the Saturn function. The Saturn is only the restrictive aspect of it, but it takes place in an expanse that is more than Saturn.
Yes.
And this is why it's the magic square of Saturn that becomes the form of the 9 chambers.
Yeah, and actually, believe it or not, it's the magic square of Saturn that is the cosmological diagram for all Taoist cosmology.
Right.
And in order to, right, so they say that, like Iamblichus used to say, that theurgy is nothing more, nothing less than a repetition of the cosmogony. And it's the same thing for the Taoist magicians. They have this interesting dance they do called pacing the low shoe, which is the square of Saturn, and they think in their sort of ceremonial logic behind it is that I am recreating the universe as I dance around this central, in this 8-fold, 9-fold pattern, which is actually really, really interesting.
Well, the last time that we spoke magic square of Saturn, we pointed out that diagonally, horizontally, or vertically, all the numbers of the magic square of Saturn add to 15. And 15 was Yud and He put together, the seed of Chokhmah and the womb of Bina. But it's also Yah, the divine name of wisdom, of Chokhmah itself. And this is all about wisdom, right? So look at the center of that image on the right. That is the magic square of Saturn, except it's not in a grid form. It's in a circular form. Those are the numbers of the magic square of Saturn in Hebrew letters. That's what that is.
Yeah, that's incredible. And in Taoism, that it's almost exactly the same. You'd take the 8 trigrams and arrange them in a circle, and that's the Bagua. That's the Bagua.
Right. That's the squaring of the circle. And the way to do it, the way to understand that, is through quadrisection itself. And I use that geometry in a lot of different ways.
Yeah.
But here it's sort of spinning in references to the organ systems that allow it to assume visionary form. Now, it's very interesting. We're mentioning the Ruach in Genesis terms. When the forces of creation in the creation scenario are in undifferentiated form and are about to differentiate a universe, it's stated that the Ruach of Elohim hovers on the surface of the water. Well, what is the surface of the water? First of all, the water is undifferentiated. It only assumes differentiated form in a vessel. That's what water does. Water doesn't have a form. It conforms to any vessel that you pour it in, right? So what is the surface of any particular form of water? Well, that's the cusp of the klipa. That's the cusp of the containment that Saturn would reduce it to. So hovering at the surface is that point where back and front are meeting. And the term Ruach Elohim is Gematria 300, which is the shin. That's the fire that unlocks the whole thing about wisdom. That's
awesome.
That's what settles into the amalgamation of Tiferet and Yesod. But that point in a regular tree, like just take a regular tree with dot. The point at which the Ruach Elohim hovers on the surface would be the abyss for most people.
Okay.
Right? If you think about it, because that's the skin, that's literally the surface of things as we see them. But when that point of dot is displaced by Tiferet, having moved to that point, it becomes beauty. That's where the Ruach Elohim hovers on the water's surface.
Wow.
Which is a totally different worldview.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So Ruach Elohim, it's funny because there's a line in the Fountain of Wisdom that basically says, and I'm paraphrasing here more or less, the Ruach Elohim is Ruach HaKodesh. Well, Ruach HaKodesh, literally is gnosis. So gnosis is something that we think is subjective, like in us. The Ruach Elohim is, described in this creation scenario. We think that's some objective force. When Ruach Elohim is the force of the divine creative macro, you could say, becomes equal with the Ruach HaKodesh, which is the epitome or the culmination, of the micro, then epistemological and ontological assumptions stop being separate from each other. And that's out the window. And then all you have is the one thing of the Emerald Tablet. Ruach HaKodesh equals Ruach Elohim. That's total stable gnosis. But when you get hung up on stability, you get hung up on accomplishment, and you get hung up on subjective interpretation and experience and, calculating how am I doing?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, especially in when you distill what should be an intimate and personal experience with the Sublime, when that becomes a series of grades that you have to take tests for, and you get a new badge or a new addition to your apron, it really does just kind of poison the well.
Well, think of how much more so when it's a self-initiation thing, and somebody's like in their bedroom, or in many cases the basement of their parents' house, and they're going through this process by themselves without any contact with anything. So this is actually, I don't mean to make fun of anybody, I take that back. But the thing of it is that I do think fundamentally that is incredibly important for a person who is in this self-initiation cycle to at some point have contact with somebody who knows more than they do. Because at the very least, it relieves you of the burden of being your own authority.
Yeah, which is awful for this kind of work.
How could it not be?
Yeah, that's the whole thing. That's the thing. People say, I don't know, that doesn't really resonate with me. Yeah, it shouldn't.
No. Who cares what resonates with you?
Yeah, Exactly. You're at one stage trying to get to another. When you're relying on whether something resonates with you, all you're looking for is confirmation of what you already think you know.
Yeah, that's not my truth.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, what is your truth? The truth of an idiot.
Exactly. And so, yeah.
Yeah. So stage one of
Perfect.
any process that involves any kind of practice at all is I am an idiot.
Yeah, of
You
course.
you have to take that position, because if you don't, then you're not going to grow because you think you know something.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, every time you make a breakthrough, you realize that what you thought before was completely wrong.
Mhm.
And it's got to be. How could it not be? So I look at my own practice and my own, whatever, any breakthrough in practice that I have. My first reaction is I just had a breakthrough. Okay, what did I do wrong? How did I make that determination erroneously? Because I thought something about myself, which is surely not correct.
Yeah.
And until I probe the hell out of it and beat it like a rug that I'm, bringing outside to get the dust out of it, until I beat up my own concepts,
Mhm.
I'm going to be stuck with something that conformed to the mess of my own mind, which
Yes.
could not possibly be right.
Yeah. And the thing is, this is one of the most essential steps of practice that really you never put down. And the thing is, this right here, what we're talking about is the part of practice that either people are mostly unaware of or just kind of step over it.
No, I'm committed to being an idiot till the end.
Yeah, that's it. Whether you like it or not. That's it.
Till the end of time, I will be, conforming and battling with my own idiocy.
Yeah, I think if most people are honest, that is the case. I think throughout the world for the most part, but that's we've got a lot of distractions and we take, and I think I mentioned this the last episode that we did, but we take our exoteric worldview and we approach esotericism with it, or let's say we take our mundane way of filtering information and we're trying to bring that to mystical praxis, and it's no wonder we don't know what we're doing, and it's difficult, and a lot of people just swear it off like it's not real.
Well, in our own defense, there's really not much choice. I mean, we sort of have to go through that.
Yeah, yeah.
We have to, because we're stuck and locked in the associative patterns of the networks of our own conceptuality. We
Mhm.
can't just wish that away. That is going to be the case until we break through it, which, of course,
Right,
we ourselves are not in a position to assess the effectiveness of that.
right. Yeah, the point is to break through and not remain in that state of confused, spiritual adolescence at that point.
Or to just improve to whatever degree, humble degree we can, to just make things better than what they previously were. Don't have the grand concept of what you think it's going to be ultimately down the road. Just take where you are today and try to move it forth like an inch or a couple of inches.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember when I first started in something like even the Golden Dawn, right? I mean, I had certain experiences that informed me, but it was really in my experience in the Outer Order of the Golden Dawn that took that state, that material, and kind of allowed me to mold it into something by going down this road, this trajectory of self-examination and etheric practice and stuff like that. But I didn't I did not know what magic was. I didn't there weren't Reddit groups, there weren't even, really any YouTube channels at that time. So it was a discovery. I enjoyed it every day. Each practice was learning something new. I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know what was supposed to be happening, but I kind of, joyously participated in the exercises, and that made even the most minute changes, very loud, to a certain degree, or at least I'll say appreciable. I could appreciate these things because I wasn't, it's like if somebody gives you a really nice, I don't know, a piece of jewelry or a stone or something, but your eye is on that, 100-pound diamond all the way across, from the other side of the room, of course you're not going to be able to appreciate what you have here. So I think if people sort of curtail and shut off their expectations, which ultimately are, to your point, a product of what you think you know.
Yeah, I think that the basis of a sound practice in a best case scenario is that secret weapon that I mentioned earlier, that you could start by learning about the highest view. I mean, we have that privilege. We could become interested in the ultimate, you know, and defer to it and aspire to it. And which is not the same as, like, saying that we even understand it, but we
Right.
can begin to appreciate that which is profound.
Mhm.
And we could always defer to the ultimate. We could defer to anything we want. We could defer to our own desires. We could defer to, a set of codes of behavior. We could defer to a theology. So why not defer to the most radical breakthrough view that has ever been conceived of the Or Ein Sof? We get to have that privilege and still maintain the humility of being an idiot. And the conjunction of those two things is amazing, because you could be as much of an idiot as you are going to be and still say, I don't know. And in my unknowing, I bind to that which is most beloved to my own heart, which is the essence of the divine. So I'm going to learn about that as much as possible and try to practice what I learn as much as possible. And am I an idiot? Yes. Is the essence of the divine the ultimate use of my life and carries with it the least potential to waste my life? Yes. So if that's you, you can become a practitioner and you get what you get.
Mhm.
So that pretty much covers what I wanted to talk about with you
Well, I mean,
today.
that was beautifully put, especially that last piece there, what you said about binding yourself in your heart. So that's a really good, I think that's a good note. That's a high note to end on.
Thank you, Mr. Ike Baker. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, David. Thank you so much. Always a pleasure to perform this dialectic with you and also learn from you. So, and thank you for anybody that has stuck with us and watched the episode and the previous episode. Thank you very much.